Something happened on the evening of July 31st, 2026, that the people of Naples had never experienced in their lifetimes. Not in the last 40 years, not since the instruments were first placed in the ground to listen to what lies beneath this city. At exactly 7:46 in the evening, a magnitude 4.7 earthquake detonated beneath the Campi Flegrei, the strongest tremor recorded in this region in 4 decades, and it did not just shake buildings. It broke a record that had stood since monitoring began, and the terrifying part is not what happened in the seconds that followed. The terrifying part is what the scientists who have spent their entire careers studying this place are now saying out loud. Because for years they whispered their warnings in academic papers and conference rooms, careful with their language, mindful of the panic that plain speech might cause. That restraint is ending. What we are hearing from the researchers closest to this volcano right now should alarm every single person watching this, because the ground beneath one of the most densely populated volcanic zones on Earth just did something it has never done before in recorded history. And what the data shows about what comes next is something the people who live here, and the governments that are supposed to protect them, are not prepared to confront. The records are falling faster than anyone publicly predicted. The timeline is compressing. And the 500,000 people living inside this caldera are running out of time to pretend that the shaking beneath their feet is ordinary. The earthquake shook the entire metropolitan area of Naples at peak summer hour, injuring at least 21 people, 2 of them seriously, and forcing thousands into the streets with nowhere safe to go. People did not walk out calmly. They ran. They grabbed children and elderly relatives and pushed through doors into whatever open space they could find, because they had been told by scientists, by civil protection officials, by the engineers who have inspected these buildings, that if the shaking ever came this strong, the structures around them might not survive the next wave. In Pozzuoli, Bagnoli, and the western quarters of Naples, residents spent the evening outside comparing notes and checking on neighbors, many refusing to go back inside their homes at all. Some slept in their cars. Some stood in the street through the night, listening, waiting, feeling the ground pulse beneath them as one aftershock followed another. Because here's the thing that the international headline writers are not communicating clearly enough. The 4.7 was not the end of the event. It was the opening. What came after it continued for hours. And what the earthquake list looked like by midnight was something that even the scientists monitoring it described as unprecedented in this cycle of unrest. The people standing outside their homes were not panicking. They were making a rational calculation based on everything they had been told and everything they had felt with their own bodies. And that rational calculation told them, do not go back inside yet, do not trust the walls, stay in the open, wait. More than 60 aftershocks rattled the caldera in the hours that followed the initial strike. 60? Not a handful, not a dozen. 60 separate seismic events pounding the same structures, the same roads, the same cracked walls, one after another through the night. The INGV monitoring system, Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, the body that watches this volcano 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, tracked that, list as it grew past what a single page could contain. A second major aftershock, measuring magnitude 3.8, struck at 10 p.m. in the Gulf of Pozzuoli, and then the smaller ones kept arriving. Relentless, sometimes less than a minute apart. Each one striking structures already compromised by what came before. Each one finding the cracks in the masonry that the 4.7 had opened and pushing them a little wider. Fire crews received reports of falling plaster, cracked walls, and one section of a building facade that collapsed entirely onto parked cars in Pozzuoli. Dust-blanketed roads and vehicles. Several unoccupied buildings collapsed outright. Power outages swept through the affected neighborhoods. Over 100,000 households were disconnected from the grid in the immediate aftermath. Trains stopped in tunnels that run directly beneath the volcanic zone and could not resume service until structural checks were completed on lines that passed through the caldera itself. And the full damage assessment had not even begun when the sun came up, because it was still not safe to enter many of the buildings to inspect them. What they found in the daylight hours confirmed what the residents already knew from the feel of it under their feet. This was not a tremor. This was something the caldera had never produced before in the modern era. Something had shifted beneath the surface and it was not finished moving. Now let us talk about what this record actually means, because the word record gets used so casually in news. Headlines that people stopped registering it. Civil protection officials confirmed this was the strongest earthquake recorded in the Campi Flegrei area since continuous instrumental monitoring began, surpassing not one but 2 separate magnitude 4.6 tremors that had themselves been described as the strongest in 40 years when they struck in 2025. Read that carefully. In 2025, a 4.6 was the strongest in living memory. Then a second 4.6 arrived months later and broke that record. And now in the summer of 2026, a 4.7 has arrived and broken both of them. Each new record displacing the last, each new peak arriving on a shorter timeline than the one before it. The 2025 records broke a threshold that had held for 40 years. The 2026 record broke the 2025 records within 13 months. The intervals are shortening. The magnitudes are climbing. And if you draw a line through those data points, the trajectory it describes is not ambiguous. This is the pattern that scientists describe as an active acceleration phase. Not a plateau, not stabilization, but a system that is continuously escalating with no sign of the upward trend reversing. And when a volcanic caldera keeps setting new seismic records at an accelerating pace, the question is no longer whether something significant is happening beneath the surface. The question is, what happens when this trajectory reaches its next inflection point? Because every acceleration curve eventually meets a threshold. And the nature of volcanic systems is that when that threshold is crossed, it is not crossed slowly. This is the moment to understand what Campi Flegrei actually is, because most people hear the word volcano and they picture a mountain with a cone and a visible crater at the summit. Campi Flegrei is nothing like that. It does not look like a volcano from the outside. You can drive through it and never realize you are inside one. There are restaurants and beaches and apartment blocks and a functioning port city inside it. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. It is not a single mountain, but a sprawling caldera roughly 9 miles wide, carved out by a catastrophic eruption approximately 40,000 years ago, sitting just west of Naples, with roughly 500,000 people living within its boundaries above a system that has never fully gone quiet. The name translates directly to burning fields. This is not poetry. There are places within this caldera where the ground is hot to the just touch, where sulfur vents push visible gas continuously into the air, where the soil shifts and creaks underfoot in ways that remind you something enormous is alive just beneath it. The people who live here have built their homes, their schools, their churches, their entire generational histories directly on top of one of the most geologically volatile structures in Europe. And for decades, the official message has been consistent. The shaking is normal. The rising ground is normal. Bradyseism, the slow upward and downward movement of the surface, driven by pressure changes in the magmatic system below, is simply how this place works. Nothing to worry about. The monitoring is ongoing. The alert level remains yellow. Come for the summer. The ferries to the islands run on schedule. Everything is fine until, on the evening of July 31st, 2026, the strongest earthquake in 40 years arrived and delivered a different message in a language that required no translation. But the data underneath that official message has been telling a completely different story for years. Since 2005, the ground in the Campi Flegrei area has been uplifting by approximately 1.4 meters, accompanied by earthquakes of continuously increasing intensity. 1.4 meters. That is nearly 4.5 feet of vertical ground displacement in just over 2 decades. Something from below is pushing the surface upward, and it is doing so with increasing force year after year. The rate of uplift in recent years has been running at roughly 10 millimeters per month, faster than at any point in the current unrest cycle, faster than it was in the early years of this episode, faster than it was last year. A 2026 research paper projects that the current acceleration could reach a critical mechanical threshold somewhere between 2030 and 2034. The scientists who wrote that paper are careful to clarify that a critical threshold does not automatically mean eruption. It could manifest as new fracture systems opening in the caldera floor, as dramatically increased fumarolic activity, as localized ground collapse in areas of the caldera where the ceiling above the magmatic system is weakest. But here's the sentence that no amount of careful scientific language can soften. All of those outcomes are consistent with a volcanic system moving toward a rupture state. And in a caldera with 500,000 people living inside it, a rupture state is not an academic classification. It is a humanitarian catastrophe in preparation, being described in the passive voice of scientific caution, while the people it concerns go about their daily lives directly above it. The scientists who actually understand what lies beneath this ground have been making increasingly urgent statements, and the events of July 31st have stripped away whatever professional caution was still filtering their public communication. Giovanni Macedonio, the director of the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology in Naples, stated clearly in late 2025 that 2 of the most recent earthquakes were the strongest ever seen in this system, and that the seismic activity had already forced families to evacuate. Families who cannot return to their homes because of the structural damage. Not tourists, not temporary visitors who can simply book another hotel. Residents, people who have lived in these apartments for 30 years, who raised their children in these neighborhoods, who have nowhere else to go because they cannot sell a home that sits inside an active volcanic caldera to a willing buyer at any price. They are displaced with no timeline for return, no compensation adequate to rebuild elsewhere, no political will behind the kind of mass relocation program that their situation demands. And that was the situation before July 31st, before the 4.7, before 60 more aftershocks damaged dozens more buildings on top of every structure that had already been condemned. The crisis that existed before this record-breaking swarm was already beyond what the current response framework was designed to handle. The crisis that exists now has moved further past that framework still. An international research team modeling 75 years of unrest at Campi Flegrei published findings in early 2026, concluding that a critically pressurized reservoir containing potentially eruptible magma exists today at approximately 4 kilometers depth, and that if the unrest culminates in an eruption, it would directly impact 2 million people in the region. 2 million people. That number lives inside scientific journals and peer-reviewed publications, where it rarely reaches the public consciousness with the weight it deserves. 2 million human beings within the direct impact zone of a volcanic system that is measurably accelerating, that has a pressurized magma reservoir confirmed at 4 kilometers depth, and that just delivered the strongest earthquake in 40 years of modern continuous monitoring. And the broader Naples metropolitan area, which would face ashfall, structural collapse, and toxic volcanic gas exposure, even in a relatively contained eruption scenario, contains approximately 3 million people. This is not a regional emergency in preparation. This is a potential civilizational event in slow motion, being managed with the language of cautious monitoring and procedural preparedness while the acceleration continues and the records fall. The scientific literature has already named what this system is doing. It is the public conversation, filtered through official statements, tourism economics, and political caution, that has not yet caught up with what the data is saying. Now look at what the July 31st earthquake revealed about the infrastructure that any mass evacuation would depend on. Rail service across the Naples network was suspended as engineers inspected the tracks, including the Cumana and Circumflegrei lines that run directly through the caldera zone and would be among the primary evacuation arteries in any mass emergency. The port of Pozzuoli was forced to close, cutting off ferry service to the islands of Procida and Ischia. Cracks appeared in the commercial port structure itself. Power outages hit multiple neighborhoods across the affected area simultaneously. Roads were choked with people who had abandoned their cars in panic, blocking the routes that emergency vehicles needed to reach the hardest hit streets. Evacuation routes that civil protection plans depend on were damaged or gridlocked before any official emergency response had even been organized. All of this from a single magnitude 4.7 earthquake. Not from an eruption, not from a volcanic event, not from anything approaching the worst-case scenario that scientists are modeling. A single seismic event, and the transportation grid that any evacuation plan depends on was offline within minutes. This is the detail that official statements about ongoing monitoring and full government commitment cannot obscure. The infrastructure of escape was compromised before the rescue operation had even begun, and in an actual eruption scenario, those same rail lines, those same ferry routes, those same roads passing directly through the caldera floor would face conditions that a single 4.7 earthquake cannot begin to approximate. They failed the easier test. The harder test has not yet arrived. The director of the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology stated that for everyone to survive an eruption, over 500,000 people would need to be evacuated from the red zone, and that, against a pyroclastic flow, superheated to approximately 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit and moving at speeds between 30 and 60 miles per hour, there are simply no countermeasures to protect yourself. No countermeasures. That sentence was not spoken by someone posting alarming content online. It came from the head of the scientific institution that the Italian government relies on to monitor this volcano. The only viable response to that scenario is to not be there when it happens. And the only way to guarantee that is to move people out with enough time that no one remains inside the kill zone when the event begins. The current evacuation plan assumes 72 hours of advance warning. Volcanologists who have studied phreatic eruptions, the steam-driven explosions that can precede full magmatic events with virtually no detectable forewarning, know that 72 hours is a best-case scenario built on assumptions that may not hold. At Campi Flegrei specifically, researchers have warned that a phreatic eruption could occur without the conventional precursory signals that monitoring systems are calibrated to detect. The 72-hour window is not a guarantee, it is a hope. And when the infrastructure that the evacuation depends on has already been shown to fail under a 4.7, building a mass survival strategy on that hope is not preparedness. It is a gamble with 500,000 lives as the stakes. The caldera has passed through significant episodes of unrest in the 1950s, the 1970s, and the 1980s, and each one left the crust above the magma chamber a little more damaged, a little more fractured than before. The ground did not simply reset between cycles, the damage accumulated. The rock that exists above the magmatic system today is not the same rock that was there in 1970 or 1984. It has been fractured, uplifted, compressed, and refractured through multiple cycles of intense seismic stress, and the cumulative effect of that structural degradation means that any future event acts on a foundation that is already compromised. Each episode of unrest at Campi Flegrei has been more intense than the last, not simply because the magmatic system is more energized, but because the physical crust above it is progressively less capable of absorbing and distributing seismic energy without further failure. The caldera is becoming a weaker vessel for a pressure source that is becoming stronger. That is the geological reality beneath every headline about records and aftershocks and monitoring and preparedness. A weakening container, a growing force, and the question of what happens when the container's remaining strength is no longer sufficient to resist. What it is holding is not a question that monitoring can continue to answer. It is a question that only time, and the decisions made or not made in the time that remains, will resolve. What no official body will say publicly, but what the aggregate of the peer-reviewed scientific literature makes increasingly difficult to ignore is this. Campi Flegrei is not in a phase of normal volcanic restlessness. It is in a documented acceleration sequence with no precedent. In the modern monitoring era, records that stood for 40 years are being broken annually. Ground that held stable for centuries has risen by more than a meter in 20 years and shows no sign of slowing. A magma reservoir at eruptible depth has been confirmed by multiple independent research teams. And on July 31st, 2026, a swarm of more than 60 seismic events anchored by the strongest earthquake the system has produced in 40 years of continuous monitoring, demonstrated that Campi Flegrei can already produce infrastructure collapse, mass displacement, injuries, and citywide disruption without a single volcanic eruption. The eruption itself, if it comes, would arrive into a region whose escape routes have already been proven vulnerable, whose buildings have already been cracking under seismic loads, well, below eruption threshold, and whose population has been living with the assumption that warning will come in time and that the systems built to move them will function when needed. July 31st tested 2 of those 3 assumptions. Neither held cleanly. The people who slept in their cars in Pozzuoli on the night of July 31st were not irrational. They were not overreacting. They were doing what people do when they have lived long enough in a dangerous place to understand that the officials, who are supposed to protect them, have consistently prioritized economic stability and political optics over honest risk communication. They knew what the 4.7 meant. They felt it in their bones and in the shaking walls around them, and they made the only rational choice available to people who have been given no real path out. They stayed, close to the open sky, away from anything that could fall on them, and they waited for dawn with no certainty that the worst was behind them rather than still ahead. Because the caldera is still active. The aftershocks have not fully stopped. The ground is still rising. The magma reservoir remains pressurized at 4 kilometers depth. And somewhere beneath the feet of 500,000 people who have nowhere else to go, the pressure continues to do what pressure has always done when the structure containing it becomes progressively weaker. It builds, it finds the fractures, it pushes. And the question that nobody in authority is ready to answer on the record is the only question that truly matters right now. How much more does this system have to show us? How many more records? How many more swarms? How many more families sleeping in their cars and waking to find their walls cracked and their port closed and their trains stopped? Before the people responsible for these 500,000 lives finally decide that the time for cautious language has passed, the time for honest action is already long overdue.